Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 86 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Today, we're going to start what I like to call our light summer reading series. We're going to do probably 10 episodes on a book that I read recently, and I really wanted to talk about it with Jerry. And it's Johnathan, I think his name's Haidt would be it's Haidt, and I have really no idea how to pronounce that. But it's called the Happiness Hypothesis. And what I really loved about this book is that he takes ancient wisdom and ancient ways of thinking from different philosophical and religious points of view, and he really compares it to modern science. And it was a really great book. It's not a light read for most people, but it's really well done. And if you're an audiobook fan, the audiobook is incredibly well produced. The voice on the audiobook is really brings you into it and does a good job. So we're going to go through the concepts in the book, basically taking a chapter a week. We hope that if you don't want to pick up the book, that you'll be fine. We're going to give you a lot of background, hopefully introduce the topics enough where you won't be lost. But you know, if you're looking for a nice, informational, job-related, yet I think really entertaining and thought-provoking book, read a chapter a week with us. Listen to the podcast and go to traumainformedlens.org and let us know what you think as well. So before we get started out, let's do our bright, shiny of the objects of the week. Kurt is still busy because he's got one of those real jobs he's got to go to. So Jerry, what's your bright, shiny object of the week? I hope it at least involves a little bit of your golf trip.
Well, that was really nice, but my bright, shiny objects is finding time to escape. And my golf trip out to the coast was an escape and relaxing and enjoying life. But also, as part of that, and part is just reading a novel. That's not, and it's kind of a heavy novel. It's I think it's called Under the Scarlet Sky. It's about Italy during the Nazi during the World War II.
So you took a break from trauma.
So no, there's trauma in there, but it's the relationships and kind of looking at it. But really, some of the bravery and some of the things that were going on. I also got to watch, talking about getting away from trauma, Ruth Ginsburg's The Movie, and really about her drive to, in some ways, empower women in this country.
Awesome.
So I think, no matter when you're a traumatologist, no matter where you go, even on the golf course, there's trauma. Right?
Yeah.
You can't get away from it. Most of the time on a golf course, it's my trauma, but it is there. So I want to kind of support our getting away from our traditional kinds of podcasts this summer and looking at things in a more kind of philosophical perspective.
Yeah. Well, and I love nonfiction so much that I hardly ever go to the fiction, but I'm always reminded, especially when I find, especially sometimes that I love Russian literature for whatever weird reason I do, but sometimes the fiction teaches me as much as the nonfiction does. I think, especially from that psychological perspective. So I don't read nearly as much of it, but I always enjoy my Dostoevsky when I go that direction. So mine, and I've got a little bit of announcement for our listeners. if you're subscribed to my blog and podcast email, I lost that email list. I've been using MailChimp and they don't back up their data, and there was probably a little bit of user error involved, but I've totally lost an email list I was developing for 6 years. So you can find us on social media. You can go to my Facebook at Facebook's /Connecting Paradigms. Everything will be still uploaded there. You can follow me on Twitter to get the updates. But if you're like, where's my email? Because I've got an email from Matt every Friday for the last 6 years. Yeah, I lost my email list. The worst thing about losing your email list, Jerry, is you can't tell the people on your list why you're not emailing them anymore. So I feel like I lost something of myself with that. So I'm on LinkedIn a lot too. So, but a little lost.
Unfriend you in Facebook.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
How come I'm not getting a Facebook anymore? Somebody just pushed the button and got rid of me.
Yeah. So, but I wrote about this in the blog if you want to find it on social media. But I got to bring it out here because it was such a powerful experience. I did a 4-day series, trauma series training in Provincetown, Massachusetts, with the AIDS support group of Cape Cod. Great folks. And if you've never been to Provincetown, put it on your bucket list. This is so I've learned this is how you show where you're at on Cape Cod, and Provincetown is kind of right here at the end, and it's absolutely beautiful. So there's just, you're surrounded by this natural beauty. But the amazing thing about Provincetown, it's as far as I've experienced in the entire world, it is a very LGBTQ plus. I wouldn't even say friendly. It's an LGBTQ plus community that my wife and I would go have coffee on just a normal Tuesday, and there might be one other heterosexual couple, maybe a lesbian couple or two, and then 8 or 9 gay male couples. And it was so cool because I went there last year just to visit on a Friday night. And it was kind of like a pride parades I've been to. It was kind of a party atmosphere. But it was so great to be in this community where it just got the gay, lesbian, all the LGBTQ stuff, the rainbow flags everywhere. The fact that, 80% of your waiters were LGBTQ, none of it mattered. It just became almost boring because it was so normal. And it was such an amazing experience to be in that I was there for 8 days. My wife joined me for about 5. And it was just such a cool thing. And then it was so weird. I then was doing a speaking engagement in Albany, New York. So I rented a car, and out east, you can actually drive through a state in less than 24 hours. You can't do that out west. So I drove through Massachusetts, the Berkshires. I'd never been there, just amazing. But then I got out of the car after spending all this time in P-Town. And I was back in America. And it was so the flags were gone, the gay couples were gone. And it was just a really weird culture shock. So, it was just so cool because people didn't have to be different. It was just the normal in P-Town. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful experience. So if you ever have a chance to go spend a little bit of time there, it's a wonderful town, beautiful place. So put it on your bucket list. Love P-Town. Hope to be back sometime soon. So, so let's jump into this topic. So the first chapter in the happiness hypothesis is on the divided self. And this has been a theme of ours throughout the podcast. Maybe not a major theme, but we've definitely touched on it a few times. And one of the things I like about his work, and I was first, Jerry, I think we were both first introduced to this analogy. The Haidt brothers, Dan and Chip, wrote a book. I was introduced to them called Switch, and I think Stick is the other one, or they've written some good books, kind of from Made to Stick, yeah, kind of a marketing perspective, but very great authors, and talks about marketing in a way I think that nonprofits could benefit from as well. And so I got this analogy from them, and then have started to read this book from him, so I was kind of aware of this. But he uses to speak about our behaviors and emotions and sort of the different parts of our brain. He uses this rider-elephant analogy. And the rider really represents our cognitive self. Really, I would think he would say the prefrontal cortex, the thinking, the problem-solving parts of our brain, cortex areas, all those pieces. And so the rider sits on top, sort of has a view of where to go, has the reins of the elephant. So when the rider is in control, can help direct the elephant. And, I've used this analogy in my motivational interviewing trainings in the past. And the elephant's important too, because the elephant is the emotional side of ourselves. And he uses limbic system, amygdala, to describe that elephant. Now, one really important thing, and we've talked about this a lot in the podcast, is that if the elephant gets triggered or spooked, the rider's just kind of along for the ride, that the elephant can take over. And, if you're on a couple-ton mammal who's spooked, you don't have a whole lot of control about where that animal goes. But the other thing that I really liked about this analogy, thinking about motivation and change as well, is even if the rider sees the destination and logically knows how to get there, you also need the emotional energy to get there as well. So the elephant can both kind of derail things by getting spooked and activating that fight or flight, or just sit down in the freeze. But we also need the elephant, whether it's an organizational change or helping our clients or patients consider behavioral change. If there's no emotional connection to the change, that, yeah, you can think about it all you want, but you rarely get motion towards it. So he uses that analogy and it brings in some research from an evolutionary perspective, and some other things. I thought his concept of language and emotions were really cool as well. But Jerry, I just think about the elephant and rider analogy. I love my analogies. So I just kind of would love to get your thoughts on seeing him talk about it. I know we've been introduced at other places, and just as it kind of relates to this topic of the divided self.
Well, first of all, I think he does a really nice job of laying the groundwork for some of this, right? Of this, what we probably have talked about a lot of, top down versus bottom up.
Yeah.
Right, to kind of look at that. And that,
just explain that for people that might not have heard us talk about.
So the brain develops and functions in a hierarchical sequential manner. So the part of our brain that manages instinctually adjusting our physiology to the demands, so managing homeostasis, both increasing access to energy, but also returning back to homeostatic equilibrium, is really mediated by the lowest parts of the brain, the brainstem and the diencephalon, the midbrain there. And that the more kind of appraisal of the environment, of emotion, motivation, is more of a midbrain what we kind of call the limbic area. And finally, the newest and most highly developed, which makes us unique in the animal kingdom, is this prefrontal cortex, and cortex that integrates information that's happening in the here and now, compares it to what we experienced in the past, and then has goals towards the future and makes all those. So it's an integrative function, so that all information comes into the brain in this lower part of the region, that these lower parts, this elephant, as he would call it, processes this information much more rapidly than the higher parts of our brain. And so the elephant or lower brain regions kind of get activated, they respond, and that higher, newer regions have the ability to inhibit and regulate lower regions, right? But I think what you kind of alluded to is that Newer regions are, one is they're not as highly connected because they're newer, and two is lower regions are much more connected to our instinctual ways of being in the world. Higher regions much more require social, emotional experiences in order to develop. So what ends up happening is, although higher regions can inhibit lower ones can function independent of higher ones. Mm-hmm. So when you get into some type of level of stress or demand from the environment that exceeds our capacity to effectively respond, these lower regions engage automatic behavioral and hormonal reactions to kind of meet those demands. And the parts of our brain that is connected to reasoning and problem solving really are downregulated and shut down for the most part. Yeah. So that in this model, the elephant takes control. Mm-hmm. But really, what I think in a healthy brain is that the rider, in some ways, works in collaboration. So there's an integration of these functions. So that information that's coming up from our body, from our emotional reactions, is integrated into our thinking and then helps us to make decisions. I think he talks about there the research that says people with prefrontal cortex damage, especially in the orbital frontal cortex, the bottom of the cortex that's most closely connected to the limbic system, they lose the ability to make decisions. Yeah. Right? So emotions are really important for us to be able to weigh out different parts. And as you talked about using this motivational interviewing, you can imagine when those things aren't working really well, how hard dealing with the ambivalence would be.
Yeah. When he uses that, I mean, it is a tragic example for everyone involved. And I don't speak of it lightly, but his example of prefrontal cortex damage, he used an individual who's had a tumor in the prefrontal cortex front area of his brain. And he seemed to be a fairly normal, well-adjusted person who all of a sudden started to sexually assault people, sexually harass people, to the point where he was facing a huge amount, if not life in prison. I mean, it was child pornography, like all these things. And right before he got sentenced, he had this horrible headache, went to the emergency room, started sexually harassing everybody in the ER. They put him in a functional MRI or an MRI and realized he had this tumor, took the tumor out, he went back to normal. But then the tumor came back and all those behaviors returned, which throws like a dozen ethical questions. I mean, just, it's almost like his rider flipped backwards or something or fell off, and the elephant, it's like, gosh, do I have that elephant inside of me too? Because if this was a normal guy, I mean, I would never want to say the worst part of me would do any of those things on my worst day, and yet he probably wouldn't either. So I mean, I mean that to me, I from the first time I read the book about a year ago, that's just really stuck with me, is how, well, we're ethical, spiritual beings. Boy, if our hardware goes awry, wow, what comes out is really scary too.
So, the what I think is interesting is the rider in this model, or this kind of higher brain area, requires the presence of another rider to train it. Right? So when we're developing early in life, we need somebody who can, in some ways, feel what we feel, but then integrate it and reflect on it and then respond in a way that recognizes our separateness and our individuality and help us label that experience, right? And so in a way, your elephant is going to develop instinctually, right? you need these life experiences with other really reasonable, well-regulated, mature adults to help you develop that rider part of you.
Yeah. Whose own elephant is loving and kind. So you get the emotional nurturance there, but also then, like you said, the social regulation with the attachment and all that as well.
So I get angry and my elephant wants to take off, but I have enough control to kind of feel that, integrate it, and then make a decision as opposed to just reacting to. And that's what helps develop the rider in the people we're interacting with, right?
Yeah.
So from a trauma-informed practice, we've talked a lot about the regulatory capacity of the providers of.
Yeah. Absolutely. So making sure our elephants are calm but also motivated. I mean, that's the interesting part is you don't want a dead elephant, right? A dead elephant serves you, you're not going anywhere. So I think, it's that interesting thing about you need the elephant in this analogy to move from point A to point B and to do great work. And we've talked, especially in the trauma-informed workplace series we just wrapped up, the importance of the emotional labor. So the empathy, which I believe is both a rider and an elephant job in that way, but that we got to make sure that our emotional selves are healthy and regulated. And there's a lot about our work that can spook us, frustrate us, and make our elephants want to run like hell or charge towards somebody too.
Right.
And so I think this is a pretty easy one to put the trauma lens over. But let me see if you're kind of thinking about the same way I have. So with someone with repeated compound, complex, untreated trauma, what we, again, starting to see with the brain scans and all that is the amygdala, limbic areas, the emotional elephant, so to speak, actually can be larger in size, but is usually less regulated. So you have at times what could be a more nervous elephant, a more hyper-aware elephant, an elephant that's probably seeing danger that maybe your or I elephant might not see as dangerous, might see it as dangerous, might be running away from sticks thinking they were snakes because they're just that they've had those experiences. And also what we're seeing, again, coming out of the neurobiology that I'm reading on trauma, is that prefrontal cortex associated with the rider actually is less active and even physically less developed. And so we're almost putting a very, almost to say, I don't know if a larger elephant's the right way to look at it, but a very nervous or a very depressed and scared, on edge elephant, and a rider who might not have developed the strength or skill set to manage that elephant in an effective way. Is that kind of how you, when we put our lens over this, sort of what you see with this analogy as well?
Yeah, there's a couple of concepts I think are important to kind of, is the brain develops in a use-dependent manner. So those systems that get used the most become the strongest, and those that are used the least begin to either just not develop, or they develop and not as functionally as efficient and effective, right? So for people growing up with early life traumatic experiences of either abuse or neglect or exposure to instability and chaos, what ends up happening is those systems, a nervous system that's designed to respond to threatening environment, becomes sensitized, right? Or the flip side of it, because they're so overwhelming in doing it, they begin to shut down. So there's a lot of trauma in which the amygdala is actually underreactive and begins to shut down to kind of look at that. And because we're trauma people and we look at overreactivity, we forget sometimes that this dissociative process, things are shut down.
Yeah.
But what also ends up happening is that when there's a lack of safety, One is that person doesn't perceive other people as resources to help them manage things. Two is that it's not safe enough to look inside and be self-reflective. So lack of self-awareness, lack of self-directiveness, all those self-monitoring, all those functions that are mediated by the frontal lobes, right, are underdeveloped. So then this kind of hypervigilance to external with the lack of ability to be reflective, right? So you have the elephant who's really, really primed, and you have a rider. However, when the elephant takes off and reacts, and there's not enough experience and efficiency, effectiveness, that rider just shuts down and lets go of the reins and lets the animal go, right? So because this person doesn't see or is not open to other people helping them, then they can't use the rider from somebody else who's there who has more experience, so I can grab the reins and I can do it. They don't see that as an option. And so you have this relationship between top mediated functions being down regulated and inefficient, and more bottom regulated reactive automatic functions hypersensitized, right? So I either quickly go to a place of being helpless and powerless, or I have to fight and run to do it. However, because my top part of my brain was not taken out by a lobotomy, it still exists. So now my top part of my brain has to create a narrative about what's going on. And the narrative they create oftentimes creates this narrative about damaged sense of self. I'm unlovable, and whatever those narrative is, that then in some ways serves to even more hypersensitize the elephant to react to a dangerous world. So I have a narrative that doesn't help regulate the elephant. I have a narrative that is gearing this elephant up. Exactly. So that when we kind of look at the clients, they both have this hyperreactivity in the lower part of their brain, but they also have these narratives to explain it that in some ways doesn't really help them access the kind of experiences they need to change this kind of cycle.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's always a reminder for me too, is that sometimes this exact same situation we're talking about, I think the personal narrative stuff, if we just, maybe that's not included in what I'm going to say next, but the neurobiology that you're talking about can actually serve individuals really well. It's not necessarily maladaptive to their environment. So if you grow up in a war zone, you don't want your rider to strategically plan every step you make. You want your elephant to attack immediately or run away. And so, I always think it's a good reminder that whether it's a child growing up in an extremely abusive situation, whether it's somebody in the army in an active war zone, someone in an intimate partner violence situation, that if your rider and elephant are going through a jungle where there's a lot of big cats trying to eat you, you don't necessarily want to strategically think through and long-term plan every next action. So again, while this becomes maladaptive when we ask it to sit still in school for 6 hours at a time, or try to say, oh, go get a job sort of scenario, that it does evolve out of experience. And then the tragedy when we set the personal narrative stuff on top of that is the individual doesn't understand that, hey, I've just been surviving the difficult life I've been living. I'm not a bad person. I'm not a worthless person. I'm a survivor. But so it's like that, again, that elephant can be incredibly functional if you're in those traumatic situations. And so, what's functional in one situation though becomes unfortunately maladaptive in others.
I think that's a really good point. And I think it's important to understand that one of the core concepts of memory is that, and our survival is this capacity to generalize learning, right? And so as I say these words, I'm thinking, where's Kurt when I talk about this stuff? There's like
operant conditioning.
Kurt would explain it better, but the issue was it was originally an adaptive response, but it became overgeneralized that now I'm having that response even in non-threatening situations.
Right.
So what was originally adaptive becomes overgeneralized and becomes reactive.
Yeah.
Right? To kind of look at that. And so I think that what we're trying to do, one is when we engage, when we respond to somebody who's been traumatized, really what we're trying to do is minimize this generalization.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So a soldier coming back from a war, he might have been very adaptive, but how do we help him not generalize that learning to non-threatening situations?
Exactly. And just a question on that, because I think it's an interesting, I agree, and you did a good job channeling our friend Kurt. At least I think so. If he listens to this, I don't know how he's going to feel about it, but I thought you did a good job. The generalization just seems like an incredibly, at least an individual on their own, an almost impossible cognitive, not impossible, but very difficult cognitive thing to do, because I don't think the army person coming back from war and now instead of going into a war zone on a Tuesday goes grocery shopping on a Tuesday is really carrying the insight that I'm freaking out at the grocery store. I don't know why. Oh, it's because I'm overgeneralizing that to it. So I think you're absolutely right. But I, in some ways, I think from an outside perspective, we can see it. But I guess maybe what I'm trying to say is like it's so internalized in the individual that it's hard for me to say, okay, now I'm back in the grocery store. I need to go back to my mom or dad brain, my community member brain. I need to go to parent-teacher conferences when I've been fighting to keep myself and my fellow soldiers alive. So I wonder, like, is it when you think about the generalization, and I definitely get it from a cognitive, but when we think about from the individual perspective, it probably doesn't appear to them that that they are just who they are. But it would take a lot of insight to step back and say, okay, that's deployed me, and this is home me, so to speak. Does that make some sense?
Yeah. So the way, first of all, I think it's really important for us to kind of, when we're talking about developmental trauma, right? We're talking about a chronic trait in which this kind of frontal cortex has not been developed actively, right? And so for the treatment and the response has to be, in some ways, is I've got to work really hard to have this person in a relational experience feel safe, feel seen, feel heard, feel valued, and dysregulated. And then we have to have experiences where I'm exploring openly and curiously about their experience. So I am actually teaching them how to be reflective.
Yeah.
Right? They've developed in an environment where that skill was not adaptive and they didn't learn, so it didn't develop, right? So in one situation. In another situation, I had this individual who had these capacities, who was placed in an overwhelming situation, and now has trouble accessing them. So some of our trauma-sensitive, evidence-based treatments are really much more geared to that person who had these experiences, and now I'm going to create this narrative and help them develop. And so I'm reintegrating this part of their brain into the other, as opposed to this developmental insult that occurred along the way, that I'm actually, in some ways, having to meet them at their developmental level and help kind of develop it. So there are a number of people who go to war and come back, and they react, and they actually know that what they're doing is not really in line with who they are. Mm-hmm. They're just struggling to do it, and so they need some, and they see relationships as a resource to help them.
Yeah.
As opposed to, this isn't something I'm doing, this is just the way the world is. And I don't even know I'm in a re-experiencing something. I'm just experiencing it over again.
Yeah.
Right? And so they require a very different type of approach in order to address what's actually needed to happen to calm the elephant and develop the rider.
Great point. Great point. So I want to continue our thinking with the trauma lens on it. I'm not even sure the analogy helps us where I want to explore next, because when I think about the divided self and trauma, one of the things that immediately pops into my head is dissociation, and then dissociative personality disorder, where and I'm going to oversimplify this to an egregious extent, but to where we almost create separate aspects of our personality to deal with highly traumatic situations. And in my entire career, I've seen a lot of dissociation, but the dissociative personality has been a rarity, a handful of cases with the pretty extreme populations and that are struggling with extreme mental illnesses that I've worked with. But there, and again, I don't know if the analogy works anymore with this, but it almost seems like with dissociation, what I've read about it, and this is where we sort of disconnect from the reality around us as a survival technique, is that this is that dorsal branch of the vagus nerve. When we talk about fight or flight, it's that amygdala response, but this is where we start. The trauma is so overwhelming, and a lot of times we can't fight back. We can't escape, so we're just trapped in the trauma. And our elephant, I guess the best way I can keep the analogy, and it may fail us here, but it just kind of lays down and goes to sleep in some ways. And the rider is no longer really there. And one of the authors I said really, I mean, this is pretty grotesque when you think about us evolutionarily, but they said that this is very functional because sometimes evolutionarily prey didn't like to eat things that were already dead. So it sometimes gave us a chance to escape if we played dead, like think of possum, so to speak. But it was also really nice that if a tiger was going to eat you, you weren't present for every bite. And this would disconnect you, kill your pain sensors, and make that experience not as horrific in your last moments. Again, pretty devastating stuff when we start talking about dissociation. So with the divided self, Jerry, and kind of this, maybe just too extreme for the analogy, but this fracturing that we see in, again, pretty extreme cases, but I know we probably both witnessed that extremity in our careers. Kind of when you think about the divided self and all this, where does the dissociation come into play for you?
Good question, right? So, like everything else, I'll give a more complicated answer.
That's why I love asking the question.
That's right. So, for me, it's really important to understand both evolutionary and in our current functioning. We lived on the planet for a very, very long time before there was language, right? And so that part of our brain that learned and stored information and had memory, there was no language connected to it. And we still have that component. We call it implicit memory, whatever, but it really is those early circuits that allow us to learn skills, to replicate things that really are outside of our conscious awareness, that we kind of look at. Then as evolution, we developed language, we developed the capacity to live in social groups, and we've developed the ability to both to encode and store and recall information in words and share it with each other, right? And these memory systems on a good day and under good conditions work in an integrated way.
Yeah.
Right? So that when this more declarative memory, that language develops slower, and it's really mediated by higher regions of the brain as opposed to the slower, right? So as we just talked about is under stress, the lower parts of the brain become more activated and higher parts become downregulated. Mm-hmm. The same thing happens with memory, is that lots of memory for some trauma is actually hyper memory. We remember it in a hyper way because it's important and it's valued and it gets stored in our memory. And 9/11, we can actually remember where we were, what was going on. They call them sometimes flashbulb. So that's where the experience didn't really overwhelm us, but it was labeled as so important. We stored it in this kind of declarative memory in a way that it's really, really clear we can kind of do it. However, when things get overwhelming, we disconnect from this declarative memory, and this implicit memory still functions. So, for example, when I'm being sexually abused, I don't look at my abuser. I look someplace else. I may actually have some depersonalization and feel like I'm watching it from outside. But that memory, declarative memory, requires attention to encode. Implicit memory doesn't. So I can have a memory of an experience without having any conscious awareness that I remember. Mm-hmm. That's one type of dissociation, right? So that I remember, I have this kind of vague sense that something bad happened, whatever it may be, but I don't really recall what actually happened and what was going on, but my body does. Yeah. Right? And to do it. So that's one type of dissociation in which the elephant has very clear memories, but the writer is clueless. Mm-hmm. Right? The other type of way to think about this is that all of us every day have a committee inside of us, right? I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a psychologist, I'm a friend, right? I have all these selves inside. And that when I have an integrated self that is able to create a coherent, integrated sense of myself with all these pieces of it, mm-hmm. right? So really this kind of sense of we have one self is really not really accurate of what actually happens with us, right? Mm-hmm. But when you have people who under a great deal of stress or they're raised in a part where piece of them is not accepted or causes other people to react, I have to somehow disown that piece of me, right? And for some people, in some models like internal family therapy, they have labels for all of those models, right? The protector, in other models, like in structural family, they'll talk about where the fight, the flight, the submit, and the cry for help are all not integrated. Mm-hmm. Right? And so these states that we all get into when we're stressed, when I'm in a fight state, I'm not aware of my need for crying for someone else or to kind of do it. Or when I'm being compliant, I'm not even aware that I'm angry about this. So I disown, these pieces become fragmented, and that I become, in some ways, each piece is dealing with a different piece of me. So when I come in the office and I'm angry at you, I don't hold on to the part that in some ways I need you and I want your help. I'm just want to kill you at that particular point, right? And so what we want to look at, as you keep kind of coming back to it, is this is a disruption of what normally happens within us. We have these fragmented pieces of us that get integrated.
Yeah.
And that treatment is about integration. It's not about desensitization. It's not about helping you. It's about how do you integrate that part of you that had to survive with this, that part of you that this is becoming problematic. How do we integrate the part of you that's angry at me and the part of you that's still, right? That's the part of the process of creating where the writer is really aware of all those pieces and then integrates them into how they want to kind of respond to the world.
Yeah. So when we look at the language piece, so you gave so much great information there. So if I experience, like, let's say, because this is where I've seen this in my own work, repeated sexual abuse, usually within the family system where it happens on a regular basis. I can't run away because somebody threatens me that something terrible happens. I can't fight back because I don't have the physical strength to do so. So all I'm left there is to freeze, basically. But my writer, as you're talking about, might, because of the chemicals that were released, disassociates during that experience. So I can't I get the explicit memory, right? I can't recall the event. I'm right with that, right? The labels. I just can't, like explicit is I think about my last birthday and I can remember what that happens. So when you're helping someone in treatment bring these pieces together, how do you help somebody bring in a piece that they might not know to some extent or remember in any sort of meaningful, logical, coherent, episodic way? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we're bringing pieces in there. So
what you're asking is, how do I make implicit memories explicit?
So you can work with putting language to them.
Right? And how do I create a narrative that kind of explains it, right?
Yeah.
And so there's been two major streams of thought. One is you go in Freudian, you sit down and you free associate and you do it, or you do a cognitive behavioral therapy and you kind of change the narrative.
Yeah.
Right? However, that's working with the writer, not working with the elephant.
Exactly.
Right? So the more recent kind of way of thinking is what we call this bottom up, is working with the body, working with creating certain states in the body, and then helping that person reflect on what's happening in their body, and then them creating a different narrative about that.
Yeah.
Right? So, for example, I might not be, because of in my family, being angry might actually put me at more risk and threat of being hurt, or maybe my mother being hurt or something. So I disassociate my anger. So I talk about something, right?
Yeah.
But when I'm talking, my hands clench. So I might say it seems like you're angry. Tell me about why you're angry. Your hands are clenched, right? That's a top-down approach. Or I might say, I want you to pay attention to your hands and what it's feeling. What do you feel in your body when your hands are in that way? Mm-hmm. What do your hands feel like doing? Right? What kind of movement? Because what we believe is some part of trauma is the actual movement, the fighting or the running away was stopped.
Yeah.
So it's trapped in the body. So it might say, I feel like pushing away from this right now. So I might actually have them push and see what that feels like, right? To kind of look at that. Or I might say to them, let's get up and jump on the trampoline and instead of getting frozen, let's see what happens in your legs and your body when you're on the trampoline. And And the thought is that when I ask them to reflect on what's happening in their body, I'm actually activating the writer to look inside, which that's what stopped, right? But I'm not asking them to look at the narrative. I'm asking them to look at themselves.
Yeah.
So they begin to feel, but I'm also communicating in the relationship that I'm interested in what's happening inside of you, not interested in changing you or to do it, is that you are really okay. So that what I want to kind of do is, I'm really, and Daniel Hughes talks about this, I want to create an acceptance, be curious and be empathetic and validating, so that you begin to have an experience in this relationship of safety that allows you to move into this reflective, which allows the part of, right? Which is a bottom-up relational. So there's a relational component, there's a body, and then we're also activating this top part of the brain, right? But as soon as we talk about trauma, the front part of the right is going to go, I'm gone, and the elephant's gone.
Yeah.
So we've got to find a way to do this in a way that allows it to what Peter Levine calls, what does he call it? He calls it basically titrating, or going back and forth between something that's stressful and something that's kind of comfortable.
Yeah.
Kind of looking, I forget the word he uses, but really this kind of bottom-up approach that also incorporates the cognitive experience of the here and now, using the writer so that I bring in the writer on top of a safe elephant.
Yeah.
Right? In your model. I don't bring the writer in when the elephant's at it, because the writer doesn't have the skill and the elephant is just too out of control. So I have to create this relational experience that are safe, that is validating, that is curious, and I'm open to your experience, that allows us to kind of create some change. And that each of the techniques, are really important, but really they account for 15% of the change, right?
Yeah.
So it's really this process of me being attentive and attuned, that when I notice you're getting overwhelmed, I can help you so that you begin to see this experience of, you could begin to use me as a co-regulator.
Yeah.
Right? You've grown up in a world where there was nobody to help you. So when I'm attuned to you, you begin to have this experience of, I'm not alone with this anymore.
Right.
I'm borrowing your writer.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what I said earlier, that the writer really depends on the experience of a more experienced writer to help them develop those skills.
Exactly.
So that's how I think about this, so that we then move towards reintegration of that. And then we help people create different narratives of their experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just think, boy, how I appreciate and I think we're getting great, like using yoga, for example, to do something. I mean, there's some really great stuff coming out there, but, I think also it just shows the complexity of, if you're not in that therapeutic role and that person's blowing up in your classroom or in your waiting room, how complex, the complexity behind that behavior. And, I appreciate it. I hope our audience does too. It's like, I kind of look at this, and it's not a perfect analogy, like no analogy is perfect, but like for a lot of us, our personalities are kind of like a mirror, and there's chips in our mirror, and there's different aspects to that personality. Like you mentioned, there's the husband side, there's trainer Matt, there's Matt on the last night watching the NBA finals Matt, and they're all different and unique, but they're all sort of connected at a central hub. Whereas trauma, especially severe repeated trauma, kind of that glass in some ways shatters, and there's not necessarily, most of my behaviors I can reflect on and understand, okay, this is where that emotion came from, or this is where that behavior that I wasn't really proud of at the time, but this is why that kind of happened. And then a lot of our folks who have been just struggling, again, that divided self, so to speak, the language he uses, kind of makes that insightful process much more difficult, at least initially. So having somebody reflect on their consequences for a behavior, and they're saying, well, I didn't do anything wrong. One of the biggest things trauma's told me is they might really believe they didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes they just might try to get out of a consequence, but it's much more, the complexity there is something I've really learned to appreciate over the years as well.
Right. And the role of that writer is to act like they're in control, whether they are or not. So
exactly.
They create a narrative that really may not at all have anything to do with actually what happened, but there's a narrative, right? So you ask a kid, why did you do that? And that kid doesn't want to tell you, I have no clue, teacher, and they did it. So they make up a story, and then you are dealing with their story, but their story may not at all be connected to why they turned around and hit somebody.
Exactly.
Right? Well, he looked at me and he took my pencil, but really what happened with the elephant, not with the writer.
Yep, absolutely. And we're trying to communicate and problem solve with the writer who may not have even been around at the time.
In my experiences, that's very confusing for foster parents, for caregivers, for teachers, for
the kid or a person we're trying to help.
Officers, is that in some ways we want to infer intention on people's behavior.
Yeah.
Right? And so the fact that there's an unconscious elephant driving something doesn't really compute or make sense in my narrative of the world.
Yeah.
Right? You have to be accountable. If you're not accountable, how, like this person with a tumor on the brain, were they accountable for their behavior?
Yeah. Yeah. Are they? Take the tumor out and they're not dangerous anymore.
That's the ethical question.
Exactly.
Right? So as we kind of wrap this up, really what I want to ask our listeners is to pay attention to this committee that's inside of you and what a complex process it is for you to integrate those things.
Yeah.
And imagine if one of those roles that you had or one of those emotional states actually functioned independently. What it would be like to deal with that in your life. That we all have that, but for most of us, we have this integrated self that puts these things together and we have right? But for lots of our clients, they lose that capacity.
Yeah.
It allows you to have some level of empathy and compassion. And I think that part of the healing practice is somebody to be with somebody else who has compassion for them.
Yeah. Awesome way to end. So as you can tell, we really like this book, and it gets even better. I've read it through once. I'm really excited, Jerry, to read it together because I just came away with every chapter like, boy, there's 4 or 5 things in each of these that I think putting the trauma-informed lens over really takes these big issues that we talk about. And I think what I love what he does is he blends that with the science as well. And I think it gives us a really good context to have some fun conversations. And as you all can see, it's a lot to learn about trauma within these pieces as well.
You know, the last piece I want to say before we go, because I know it's time's up, is in all of these books, they're reviewing research.
Mm-hmm.
And you are having an experience. And there may be things in the research that don't seem to fit really well with your experience. And I think it's really important just to sit with that and try to make sense of that piece, right? Because research is fragmenting these and looking at different pieces of these, kind of looking at it. You're dealing with this whole person that's in front of you, that's complicated, that is unique, that all of this research kind of talks generally about people, but you have a person in front of you. And I think you have to take what we talk about and figure out, how does this apply to the person that I'm with?
Yeah.
as opposed to the research. And I think that's a challenge whenever you read these books is how do I bring it back to the intersubjective experience of being with another individual as opposed to this cognitive kind of knowledge process.
Well, and you know what I hope about this is it makes us, you know, and I think this is where the trauma-informed lens really gets its big value from is be curious. You know, I can't imagine working with the gentleman who had the tumor and all of a sudden became a sexual predator, right? I probably could have had 100 cognitive theories about what was wrong with this guy, and even, you know, and they would have all been wrong. And so to keep that curiosity and also always fall back. So the curiosity is number one. The compassion is number two, because we don't know, because they may not even, when we do our assessments, they may not even remember the worst things that have happened to them and maybe the biggest influence on some of their behavior. So compassion, curiosity, and always no matter what, the better the relationship, the better the outcomes. All this knowledge, still, if you can't create a genuine relationship with somebody, it's going to have limited impact. So great discussion, Jerry. This was a wonderful way to end my week, and I hope our readers and our listeners enjoy it as well. As always, I'll throw some discussion questions, including having you think about the committee inside your head. I add that one at the end. Show notes at traumainformedlens.org. Again, the book is Johnathan Haidt's, Haidt. I'll just spell it out for you. The Happiness Hypothesis. I find it on Amazon again. Big fan of the audiobook there. I think the audiobooks have done really well. So if you want to catch up, read that. We'll take on the second chapter. I had it pulled up here just a second ago, and then you lost me in all this great conversation. So next week, this is a good one I remember. It's about changing your mind. So I remember this one from my last time. I'm excited to get into this because it kind of brings some of my MI thinking and motivation in there as well. So we'll continue the discussion next time. And as always, have a great week. Jerry, it's been a blast, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.